Thank you. So the second way you can spend your money is to spend your money on somebody else. In that case, you still have a good incentive to spend your money wisely, but you do not have good knowledge about the other person. I suspect all of you have at some point received an embarrassing present from a relative who means well, but does not know you well enough because only you are an expert on yourself, and you end up with something that does not maximize your utility, to use economic language. The third way that you can spend money is somebody else's money on yourself. This is the most fun because you're not responsible for anything and you know what makes you happy, but you have no incentive to be wise in your spending. The fourth way that you can spend money is to spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Now, the problem with spending somebody else's money on somebody else is that you lack the incentive because it's not your money. You're not going to be a good, wise spender of the money. But you also lack the knowledge because you are not an expert on the other person's happiness. So there are going to be some inefficiencies in that fourth way of spending. And Professor Friedman pointed out that even if we need the state to do things for us, we have to remember that the way that state spending happens is the fourth way, somebody else's money on somebody else. So we need to be careful about that and study what institutions we can have and what rules we can have to overcome those problems. So I will start now to talk about the knowledge problem. We know that knowledge is dispersed throughout the economy. It's limited. Think about your own individual life. You acquire knowledge. Sometimes you don't know things and you can go ask a professor, or you can go to the library, or you can read a book to overcome that. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know. You don't know which questions to ask. And Professor Hayek, whom I'm about to talk about, pointed out that in many ways it is easier to be an engineer than it is to be an economist. And this may seem like a puzzle to some of you, especially given the difficult classes that engineers take. But Professor Hayek points out that if we're trying to build a bridge, for example, an engineer will look at the bridge and look at the properties of steel and look at the laws of physics and build a bridge. And the recipe for making a bridge that works today will work in 200 years and worked 2,000 years ago. In fact, we still have bridges that were built 2,000 years ago and still are standing. But an economist is going to have a more difficult situation because people do not react like particles. People cannot be studied with physics. So an economist might say, okay, we'll build a bridge now. It will have 2 lanes. We will finance it through toll payments instead of a bond issuance, instead of borrowing. But all of that could have changed in 1 year. The price of labor might have changed. The price of steel might have changed. The general economic conditions might have changed such that people are not willing to pay for the bridge, or they might want a bigger bridge or a smaller bridge. So in some ways, it is easier to be an engineer who studies matter than it is to be an economist who studies people who make choices, because the knowledge is captured inside the minds of the individual people. And the question is, how do we use it to have economic activity? And this is the great puzzle that the Nobel Prize economist F.A. Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, asked. And he said, if information is dispersed throughout all the individual minds in an economy, and if information is so limited, how is economic activity possible if we don't know about other people? Entrepreneurship is perhaps one of the most difficult things possible because you are taking a risk on what people will want in the future and how to organize resources. And then the next question that we have to ask is, where does economic coordination come from? How do we organize economic activity if that knowledge is scattered throughout the economy? The question then is, this is what Hayek points out, no planner and no computer can have sufficient knowledge to run an economy, because all of knowledge is contained within the individual minds of the people. And no central planner and no computer can plan an economy for everybody, because no central planner and no computer has access to this contained in the minds of individuals. Only the market process can liberate that knowledge. And Juan can tell you afterwards, I start my class with an example of a trade game that I start. And the students generate information about themselves and their preferences through their own exchanges in a way that I could not generate even if I had a powerful Excel spreadsheet and spent time with a matrix of 60 students by 60 objects that they might like. Instead, I allowed them to trade, and I allowed them to generate information about their own preferences. And what happens in the process is that they're also much happier with the outcomes than if I were to assign things to them, because they themselves have generated that information about their preferences. And we see this government attempts at central planning and the failures of central planning. So even at its most extreme, these are things that we saw, for example, with the Chinese turn in 1979, when China realized that central planning would not work and instead liberated the economy because the markets themselves would be more efficient at allocating the resources. We see this in a number of technologies where investments have failed because the state has tried to focus information, but it does not capture the information that is contained in the minds of people. So we come now to an article, 1945, The Use of Knowledge in Society by F.A. Hayek, and I've put the references for you at the end. Hayek points out that he explains in greater detail what I have just told you, and he explains also that planning is still required. You individually still need to plan your own lives. You individually still need to read your assignments for your classes. The market cannot take care of that for you. But the question is, who makes the decision? And Hayek's conclusion on this is that decisions should be made as close as possible to the economic actor, because the economic actor has the best information possible. This economic insight had a managerial implication in the 1980s, for example, when Toyota, the car manufacturer, realized that it was not giving decision-making authority to the right people. So, problem on the assembly line, before 1980, the worker on the assembly line had to ask permission from the supervisor, who had to ask permission from the manager to stop the assembly line. But Toyota realized that it was the worker on the line who had the best knowledge about the machines, and so that worker was given the authority to stop the assembly line if ever there was a problem. Mistakes went down, productivity went up. So this is not to say that the worker will have the best knowledge about everything. The manager or the chief executive officer will have better knowledge of market conditions and of finance, for example, but the assembly line worker is the one who has the best knowledge about the assembly line itself. We look at this in an example that I borrow from an economist I'll talk about in a moment. 8 million people in New York City get fed every day. No one is responsible for that, and yet it happens through the coordinating activities of the market. I have listed for you at the end of the lecture a very short piece that is the most delightful piece in economics. It is called I, Pencil, and it is the biography of a pencil. And in this piece, Leonard Read, the author, wrote in 1956, nobody in the world can make a pencil alone. Nobody. Because a pencil requires wood, it requires graphite, it requires metal, it requires rubber for the eraser. All of these ingredients come from different countries, which means that it also requires boats to carry the materials across the ocean, and it requires bankers to coordinate the activities amongst all of them. So no one individual can make a pencil. Imagine if you were to try to make a pencil just starting out to dig the iron out of the ground with your hands, because you need to rely on somebody else for tools. And the puzzle is, if a pencil is so complicated that nobody alone can make it, how is it that pencils are cheap and they are abundant, and we find pencils easily and cheaply? even though they are so complicated to make and have inputs from so many different countries? The answer, of course, is the price mechanism, because the price mechanism is going to give information to the actors. It's going to give them an incentive to work together, and it's going to coordinate the activities of all the different economic actors. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to introduce him briefly. The French economist Frédéric Bastiat talked about this in the 19th century, and I will move on to Professor Mises, another Austrian economist, who talked about the dynamics of intervention. This is relevant here because Mises pointed out So good afternoon, everybody. The internet appears to be back, so we'll return to iPencil. iPencil is the shortest and most delightful piece of economics that you will ever read. I recommend it to all of you. It's available on the internet. And it's the autobiography of a pencil. And it points out that pencils have ingredients from multiple different countries. The wood comes from one country, graphite comes from another country, the rubber comes from another country. And so no one individual can make a pencil alone. It requires the coordinated activities of multiple people in multiple different countries. It requires international shipping. It requires international banking. And despite all of this, even though pencils are complex, even though pencils require ingredients from multiple different countries, and even though no one person can make a pencil alone, are cheap and they are abundant, even though nobody is in charge of making them. And so the puzzle in all of this is how pencil activity, how pencils can be made, even if they are so complex and have ingredients from so many different countries. And the answer is the price mechanism, which provides the knowledge necessary for the different actors to work together. The price mechanism provides the incentives for people to cooperate, and it provides the coordination without anybody being in charge. I will, for the sake of time, jump over Frédéric Bastiat, who's a French economist from the 19th century, but I gave you some examples of the readings. And I want to step to the next economist in our journey here, who is an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises, who wrote about the dynamics of intervention. Mises's argument is that anytime there is an intervention in the market, even if it is well-meaning, that intervention is going to block the market process of information, and it's going to distort and cause problems in another market. And in turn, that market will need another intervention to fix it. But that intervention, again, if it is well-meaning, is going to have a distortion in another market as it breaks the market process. So we have one intervention leading to a whole series of different interventions. Take the example, you are the Minister of Agriculture, and you are worried that milk is too expensive for poor children. So you pass a law saying that it is illegal to sell the milk for, let's say, more than $2 for a bottle of milk. I'll use the US example of $2. And you, by doing that, you are going to be helping the poor children get access to milk, because instead of being $4 as it was originally, it's now $2. The problem with that is that if you are the owner of cows, if you're a dairy farmer, you find yourself in a situation where input costs are the same. The cows cost the same, the electricity costs the same, the workers cost the same, the insurance costs the same. Your input costs have remained the same, but your output cost has just been cut in two by the government regulation. You can't keep up. So many of the dairy farmers are going to go out of business, sell the cows, and go into another profession. And the net result of that is that there will be less milk available on the shelves. Even though the purpose was to help poor children by having cheaper milk, now we have milk that has disappeared. So the Minister of Agriculture then goes back to the dairy farmers and asks them, why aren't you producing milk? And the dairy farmers explain, well, All of our production costs have stayed the same, but the sales cost has fallen. And so the Minister of Agriculture says, okay, here's what I'll do. I will pass a law that makes it illegal to sell the cows at more than a certain price. But then what happens is that we now have a shortage in the food for cows. And it goes on and on like that in a dynamic of intervention because the market mechanism has been broken. So I want to shift now from knowledge to incentive. The Austrian School of Economics says, even with good incentives and the desire to help the world, policymakers will often not have sufficient knowledge to do better than the market. Public choice theory uses the exact opposite approach and says, even with perfect knowledge, we have to be careful about the incentives that policymakers have to help themselves versus helping the world. So, in public choice theory, I want to cover a few basic concepts for you. I want to look at the differences between private and public activity and introduce an economic theory of government, and then have an analysis of the kinds of cases in which government works and the kinds of cases in which government does not work. So I want to start very briefly with a little bit of history. The two primary founders of public choice theory are James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, who were professors at George Mason University when I was there, but they were already relatively old and they were only teaching a class occasionally. If Professor Betke has an opportunity to give a lecture to your class, you can ask him personal stories because he was in class with Professor Buchanan. The main point of public choice theory is that people are people. Instead of saying that people act certain ways in markets and they're selfish, and people act other ways in government and they try to serve everybody, public choice theory says people are people and they respond to incentives. So to try to understand people, let's look at their incentives rather than at the type of job that they're doing. So I want to start briefly with looking at some differences and similarities between private action and public choice. The first thing to remember is that competition exists in both sectors. Money is scarce, time is scarce, so there's going to be competition in the market between and among different companies. And in the state, there is going to be competition amongst different bureaucracies. Different branches of government will want different activity, so there will be competition. Number two, we have to keep in mind, this is a very complex economic term, but I'll simplify it for you. The public sector can break the individual consumption payment link. What this means is that in a market setting, people get what they pay for. In a government setting, it is possible for some people to pay very little and receive many benefits, and other people to pay very much and receive no benefits. This happens in the US, for example, with people who have or don't have children. So in the US, education is paid for on the basis of property taxes. So you could have somebody with a big house and no children who pays a lot and does not receive any educational benefits, and somebody with a smaller house and many children who pays little but receives many educational benefits. This would not happen in the market system, but the difficulty then is that there tends to be a distortion of incentive as people will want more of a good that they're not paying for, and we'll come back to that. The third thing to remember is that scarcity exists in both worlds. This is often forgotten in public choice, but we still have a situation of scarcity. Number four, in the market sector, in private action, choices are unanimous. If I have something that you want and you have something that I want and we trade, we both need to agree to the trade. Whereas in the public sector, decisions can be made on a majoritarian basis, especially in the case of a democracy, where all you need is 51% of the votes rather than a unanimous distribution. Again, this is going to have economic consequences. The fifth thing that we look at is the bundling problem. In the private sector, in market choices, you can choose to buy different things as you want. Whereas in a public situation, the two are bundled together. Think about a politician whose domestic policies you might like very much, very good on economics, but whose foreign policy you don't like, but you have a choice between one and only one, and you cannot make a differentiation between the two. And number 6, in general terms, we'll come back to this also in a moment, the income and power distribution within the private sector versus the public sector, because in the public sector, people have one vote, whereas in the private sector, people can vote with their money on different things. So why does all this matter? You can look here at a brief economic theory of government. And my point here is simply to introduce you to some of the ideas of how economics can illuminate political theory and how we think about governmental organization. At the very basis, we have the so-called anarcho-capitalist of thought, which says that markets and private and civil society, markets and families, clubs, etc., voluntary organizations can handle everything. We can have private provision of security. We can have private provision of roads. That is one approach using economics, saying that markets can provide everything that people want. Stepping up one more are theorists of the protective state who say that that is not true, that it is necessary to have at least police and military provided by the state, because the market cannot provide those and you would end up in a situation of civil war. The productive state theorists agree with the protective state that it is necessary to have basic police and military and court protection, but they think that it is necessary also for the state to fix small problems with the market failure, and then stop right there. And then the redistributive state assumes that the state actually needs to step in and redistribute income and opportunities amongst different people. So I present these to you as we look at an economic analysis of government as we move forward with this. So, economists generally agree that the state is good at providing rule of law. That is, the state is generally pretty good at providing an independent court system, at providing basic protection of property rights so that commerce can take place. But then there is more question about whether the state can actually provide things that the market can't provide. Is it possible for the state to do so? If the market is unable to do so, if voluntary activity amongst people with incentives does not provide the things that we want, will we be able to provide those things in a way that the market is not able to? And that is the big question that we have. So there are 4 specific cases that public choice theory outlines in categories where the state action does not work and it is broken and we have to find some other way to get what we want. The first is what is called the special interest effect. This is a situation where one interest is able to capture the government process for private benefit. So I like to joke for my students, for example, that we should all pass the Wenzel for America law. And this law says that every person in the US pays $10 a year that goes to me. I like this law very much, because if you multiply the 300 million people living in America by $10, that goes into my pocket. But the problem with that is it's not a good law. It's not an efficient law. It is not a just law. But I will spend a lot of time and resources protecting that law because I have so much to gain. On the other hand, the people who are paying for it do not have an incentive to organize because each individual one is paying only $10 per year. It's not worth organizing, so they will not organize and the law will stay put. And we see many examples of this, and I will continue with the theory before I give examples. We see many examples in the US of laws that benefit concentrated benefits, special interests, at the expense of everybody else, which is of course very inefficient, but it is also not a question of justice because everybody is made to pay for one small specific sector. The second problem that we see is the short-sightedness effect. This means simply that in the political realm, there is less incentive to acquire information. We can take two people in the US, for example, as the election is coming up. One person reads 4 newspapers every week. One person does a lot of research on all the candidates, and that person still has 1 vote. A person who does no research, does not read newspapers, and is not aware of the political process also gets 1 vote. So in a democracy, there is not an incentive to acquire information. And because of that, there tend to be in the political process short-sighted activities that have an immediate benefit now, much higher cost later on, because people in power, policymakers, politicians, like to give benefits to people now, and people are happy, even if it's an economically inefficient policy that is going to be much more expensive in the future. And this is how deficits come. So you may know in the US, for example, the US government debt is greater than economic activity for 1 entire year. So the debt is at about 105% of economic activity because of this short-sightedness effect. The third problem that we see is something called rent seeking. Rent seeking is just a polite way of saying using the power of the state to extract money from other people. An example of this, in the United States, in order to be what we call an emergency medical technician, this is the person who rides in the back of the ambulance and saves your life, is required to have 400 hours of training. And in those 400 hours of training, you learn basic medicine, you learn how to save people so you can get a license to be a medical technician. At the same time in the US, on average, in order to be allowed to cut somebody's hair, you have to take 1,600 hours of training. Almost an entire year of work to be allowed to cut somebody's hair, even though it takes only 400 hours to be allowed to learn how to save somebody's life. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's because those who are already established as barbers, as hair cutters, as what we call beauty salons in the US, have been able to capture the political process to make it mandatory for people to get a license so that they can win competition, reduce the supply, and keep their own wages up. This is an example of what we call rent seeking, where those people are engaged in the activity of trying to protect themselves from the competition. The fourth problem that we see with state action, even if it is necessary and even if we decide that we want the state to provide certain things, is that the state does not have competition, so it does not have the same discipline. If I go to buy a sandwich in a restaurant that is not nice to me, that provides to me a sandwich that does not taste good, I go across the street to buy a sandwich somewhere else. But if I go get my driver's license or my passport and the agency does not treat me well, I do not have the choice of going across the street. I have only one opportunity to get my passport or my driver's license or pay my taxes. So there's going to be less of an incentive for government bureaucracies to be responsive to consumers because they do not have the competition. They won't lose the customers. So we have to worry also about the failure of government. And this is what public choice tells us. Public choice is really not saying government can never work. What public choice is saying is we need to be cautious, design institutions effectively so that government can serve us instead of the people who are working within the state. I have here a little example, a little graphic of political capture in the US. And I want to close with a few examples. In US history, we have the example that we call the Baptists and bootleggers problem. The Baptists are the religious fundamentalists who want alcohol banned because they believe it is sinful activity to drink alcohol. The bootleggers are the criminal groups that are willing to provide illegal alcohol, and they also want alcohol to be banned because they know that if alcohol is banned, the supply will fall, the price will rise, and they are willing to engage in illegal activity to provide that alcohol. So we find strange coalitions in the US where we have, on the one hand, the very religious groups, and on the other hand, the criminals who want the exact same thing. And they can work together. Bootleggers will provide the financing, the money. The Baptists will provide the respectability. And working together, they can get the same thing that they want, even though they are approaching the problem with very different assumptions. And we see this in the U.S. I have a number of examples for you here. There's a big push in the U.S. right now to transform corn into ethanol to power cars because it is better for the environment than gasoline from petroleum sources, from oil. But the problem that we have is that corn actually is very inefficient. Corn does not make energy, and corn gasoline, corn ethanol is actually more polluting to the environment because it requires so much energy to produce. If the real reason behind this policy were really to protect the environment, what the US would do is use sugar instead of corn to create the ethanol to power the cars. But the problem with that is that there's a powerful sugar lobby in the United States that prevents foreign sugar from coming in and places a tax of about $20 per American per year on sugar, because sugar is more expensive because the American sugar industry cannot produce it efficiently. And so we end up in this case with every American paying an extra $20 per year for sugar. And we also end up with a product, corn ethanol, that is actually bad for the environment. But the idea is not really the protection of the environment. If it were, we would be importing sugar from foreign countries. Instead, big push to government to subsidize the corn ethanol, even though it's bad for the environment, but it really has to do with protection of the voting power of the politicians in the central states in the US that produce corn and other agricultural products. So this is another example where we see a special interest effect hurting what we actually want as an outcome. There are many other examples here that I have for you. For those of you interested in economic history, after the banks failed in the US in 1929, a good number of them were bailed out by the federal government. That is, the federal government injected money into the banks. Well, in 1929, the president was a Republican and saved almost exclusively banks that were owned by Republicans. When the markets failed again, about 6 years later, banks were again bailed out. This time there was another president from a different party, the Democratic Party. Democratic president gave money almost exclusively to banks that were owned by Democrats. So even though on the surface we have an argument that the government is trying to stabilize the economy, in reality what is happening is that this was used as an opportunity to help friends as opposed to help the economy as a whole. So we have here a number of different examples for which I'll jump. The summary of this, Wang asked me to talk for 40 minutes, and it's been about 40 minutes, so I will wrap up now. The summary of all this is that if policymakers indeed have good intentions and good knowledge, everything's fine. You don't need to worry. But if we cannot assume that they have good intentions and complete knowledge, we will need to design some institutions that are strong enough or robust enough to overcome the problems, to allow for economic growth and to allow for human flourishing. And that's why we have the School of Robust Political Economy, which is going to argue we need to be aware in our design of institutions that policymakers may not have the best of intentions in protecting us, and that they may not have sufficient knowledge. So it would be a subject for a separate lecture to talk about the details of what those institutions look like. But largely what they come down to is, number one, allowing the market process to function, allowing the market process to generate knowledge. And number two, placing constraints, placing limits on the powers of policymakers to make sure that they are acting with incentives that they have to serve the general public and not to serve themselves. So I close here with a list of readings. I don't expect that you will read them all this week. There are some basic readings and some more advanced readings. If you have questions about the readings, please let me know. If you have difficulty accessing the books, please let me know and I can help you with that. But I wanted to give you at least a basic list here. And if you have any questions after this lecture, I'm happy to stay online to take questions that you might have. But if you have a question that comes up tomorrow or 2 weeks or in a month when you're doing some more reading, you're welcome to send me an email asking me the question or asking me for additional readings if that is of interest to you. And with that, I thank you all for taking the time on this Saturday afternoon to listen to my lecture. I hope it brought some good insights, and it certainly was exciting to talk to you. So thank you very much. And Huang, it might be easier to use the chat function for any questions rather than speaking to me.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now, we're happy to take questions from the audience. And please be sure